Good evening, everybody. Welcome to History Pub. My name is Kelly. I'm the director of the Historical Museum. Oh, am I still there? I'm still there. Welcome to tonight's History Pub. As usual, I have to do the spiel and say that tonight is brought to you by McMenamin's History, the Oregon Historical Society, the Oregon Encyclopedia, and us at the Deschutes Historical Museum. Thank you. I also want to point out someone tonight who she'll probably kill me for this, but I'm super excited because Carrie, who is the assistant historian with McMenamin's, has finally made it to our first History Pub in Bend. Let's wave to the people. It's because of Carrie and Tim that we get to do these things, so thank you very much. Tonight we're really excited to have the Loftus family with us. So we have David, and we have Toby, and we have Mitzi, and they're going to be speaking in kind of an interview fashion between David and Mitzi. But you're also privileged to be here on the night that this is the first time we're filming tonight. That will end up on the McMenamin's history page and the museum's history page. So that's why the sun has come out. So it's the summer that we always wished we would have had this year, just inside. Really quick, I want to put a plug in for next month's History Hub. We are actually on Halloween night this year. So we're doing something attached to that history. We've got Chelsea Rose coming over from the Southern Oregon University. She's an archaeologist. And she's going to do a special talk just for us on when the ghost world and the archaeology world kind of collides. So she has some personal stories about some sites that should be lots of fun. So plan on joining us for Halloween. Okay, I think I will pass the mic to David.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for coming. And Oregon Historical Society, of which I am a member, the Deschutes County Historical Society, which I'm not a member of, but I'd love to be because you're so active and it's very impressive to me. And the Oregon Encyclopedia, which is a project that was started by 3 professors in Salem and Portland. It was their vision to create a digital Oregon Encyclopedia, events, places, people. And if you haven't looked it up, those of you who surf the net, look it up because you can find all kinds of interesting things in there. And they're highly vetted, unlike some things in Wikipedia. I know what it's gone through. So I want to thank all of those people. And especially McMenamin's. I was invited to speak in Edgefield, and then in McMinnville, and now here. And so there's a huge list of McMenamin's, but I don't think I'm going to live long enough. That's enough for my
way to start. Okay. Hey. Hello. Okay. So I guess the first thing to find out is how did your family come to be situated in Hood River in the first place?
Okay, bring your mental cameras along because in 1904, most people didn't have a camera. I remember the first ones were the kind you held here, Kodak or box camera. Nowadays you do this. I remember these. But in 1904, there was a 24-year-old man in Japan, grew up around rice paddies, but he was the second son, which was bad news, because in Japan, the eldest son inherited whatever land or business. So my father wanted to be a farmer, but he couldn't. He had 2 other choices. The military, he was too short. They rejected. The other thing is that in Japan it's customary for a younger son to marry into a family of all girls. If he married the oldest daughter of that family, he moved into her home, becomes kind of the son of that family. My dad didn't want to do that. So he asked his mother for money for one-way passage on a freighter to the United States. And that's all. No money, just that boat passage. And it was certainly not as bad, but kind of like the slave ships. They slept on the floor in the hold of the ship like cattle, as he described it. And everybody was getting seasick, but he wasn't, so he went around helping the people who were seasick. So he lands in San Francisco and worked to build railroads, which is what the middlemen hired these men to come, gave them a place to sleep and food to eat, and then they had to work off, just like indentured servants did, had to work off that money before they could keep what money they owned. So you laid rail in California, ended up coming to Oregon, and they were laying rail from Portland east. And he saw the Hood River Valley, the Columbia River, Mount Hood to the south, Mount Adams to the north. He said, this is where I'm going to be a farmer. Well, he didn't have much money, although he had worked quite a few years. But he saved enough to buy some marginal land way up in the hills in the boondocks. Only a place where Japanese or fool would try to farm. And there was no road, so he had to build one with a horse and a pick and shovel up this hill. And he cut down the forest and sold that off, dynamited the stumps, and planted fruit trees, which back then took 7 years to bear fruit, because we didn't have dwarf and semi-dwarf trees. And since he knew nothing about orcharding, he and my mother worked for other farmers to learn how to do it.
Now, how did your mother come into the picture, though?
Well, of course, as so many Japanese young bachelors who came to this country could not afford to go back to Japan to find a bride, and so they saved enough money to get a picture bride. That meant that his mother, or in this case his mother, had to find, I don't know how many, I forgot to ask my dad, which would have been interesting, how many of these pictures were sent to him that my grandmother felt would be proper wives for my father. And he looked at them and said, B and C look pretty good. I don't know, but I think I'll go for B. And that would be my mother. So
But she didn't come willingly, did she?
No, and I didn't learn till years later when my mother-in-law, who my husband used to say is like a lawyer, she'd learn your whole history in the first 30 minutes she'd meet you, question my parents, and fortunately I learned these things. She said, well, how did you feel about coming to a strange country where you couldn't speak the language? You didn't even know the man you were going to marry? She said, I didn't want to. Oh, your parents said you had to do it? No, they gave me a choice, which in itself was pretty amazing, because in 1910, 1911, they weren't usually given choice. And so you didn't want to come, but you came anyway. She said, I said no. You said no, and you still came? Well, that lady came back again, and I said no a second time. You said no twice, and you still came? What are you going to do with a woman who doesn't take no for an answer? So I said, oh, well, okay. And that's how my mother came. She was 19, or she'd never been on a trip or anything, and she gets on a ship that takes 2 weeks to cross the ocean, just as my father went 2 weeks on this seasick people who sold a ship. My mother was on a ship with 40 picture brides. And my father told her, don't bring anything but the clothes on your back and a futon. And you know what a futon is, because we use them now. And guess what? My mother came with the clothes on her back and a futon. That sure tells you something about her. Right? Well, there were 40 picture brides, so my dad said...
And they landed in Seattle, is that
Yes, they landed in Seattle. And they went right down to Justice of the Peace and were married. But my father said, I'll be waving a green flag. So my mother had to look in the crowd of bachelors out there for the green flag. And the thing was, there was one woman whose name was, she was going to marry a Mr. Arai, and my family name is Asai. And so there were middlemen always who said, pay me $50, I'll get a trousseau together, blah, blah, blah. So this middleman comes to my father with this woman, and my father says, that's not the one I picked. And if he hadn't spoken up, he would have been, Mrs. Asai would have been his wife instead. And us, we'd look a lot different. So my mother went up to this farm where my father had built a shack to live in, and my father had no carpentry or handyman abilities, so it was a very primitive. My mother said you could see cracks, you know, you could see the light, sun through the cracks of the house. And 6 of the 8 children were born there, and my father delivered them all because it was 9 or 10 miles from town, and there was just horse and buggy days. He had a horse and a sled well, anyway, that's all he had. Well, by the time he'd get halfway to town, my mother would have given birth, so he had to deliver himself. Then later, he had another farm closer to town, 5 miles from town, and that's where I was born. And to this day, the family does orchards there. My nephew lives in the house where I was born. So he tried to deliver me, but I was kind of a problem, so he did have to go to town for the doctor.
Maybe a little more detail on that?
About the birth? Well, my mother had given birth to 7 before that, actually. My one brother was in another intermediate place. And my dad said she never let out a peep. She had a bed that had an iron kind of, you know, headboard type thing, and she put her hands up there and her arms would turn white, and the perspiration would roll down her face, but she never let out a peep. But when I was going to be born, I got stuck. And she said, kill the baby or do something. I don't know how many times I heard that story. Are you going on now? Do you want me to keep going? Well, so that's where we happened to end up in Hood River, which is my hometown. I've lived about 70-some years of my life in Oregon, and 2-3 years were not my choice to go out of Oregon. 2 years I took.
So through the teens, the 20s, and the 30s, your father was farming and raising apples and
pears and cherries. Mm-hmm. And he used to say, we will always raise apples because you can always feed your family with apples. You'll never get rich, but you'll be able to feed the family. I am so glad he didn't live to the place where apples were not a living. People went over to pears and then cherries, and now they're talking about going out of orchard business. My nieces and nephews are saying we have to quit because we can't make a living with it because the economic globalization and fruit is coming in from other parts of the world. They can sell them for cheaper than my relatives can raise it for. And some years, my nephew has let the fruit hang on the trees and fall and rot because he would be even money-wise when harvest came. And if he had to pay a picking wage, he'd go in the hole for the price of the fruit. So I used to go up and get free fruit, take up my Suburban and fill it full of apples for free. And my friends would say, what's going to happen to the rest of the apples that we didn't pick? I said, well, they're going to rot on the ground. They said, well, can't they have a you-pick thing? I said, are you kidding? When you're raising 200 ton of fruit, you're going to let people come in and you-pick them? And besides, they don't know how to use the ladder, so they fall down the ladder and they sue you. So that's the situation.
So you were the youngest of 8, and just to let folks know, her oldest sister, the oldest child, got left in Japan and grew up there. But the rest of the family stayed here in the U.S. and grew up here.
The reason she was left there, my father and mother made the first trip to Japan after they're married with 2 children. My oldest sister, whom I never really knew, and my brother, who was a babe in arms at the time. And the grandmother, that woman who never took no for an answer, she was on her deathbed and she said, leave that baby here, leave that girl here, because when she grows up, she's going to marry and be gone. She's not going to be an asset on the orchard like all the men, all the boys were, so leave her. So they left, and it wasn't until years later I asked my mother about that, and she said, I didn't want to do it, but I was afraid to speak up to my mother-in-law. So I never, and during World War II, she and her 2 children were bombed and killed in Nagoya, which is the 3rd largest city in Japan, and was burned just like Dresden.
So what was the situation in Hood River just before the war? What was the social climate for Japanese Americans at that time?
Well, of course, almost all the Japanese in Hood River were farmers. And we were integrated. We went to school, and I didn't have any problems with my peers. We had baseball teams and picnics, and I mean, just a normal kind of a life.
And then you learned about the attack on Pearl Harbor. How did that news come to you?
Yes, I was in the 4th grade, and Pearl Harbor took place on a Sunday, at least in the Pacific.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Post Japan, it would have been the 8th, I guess. It was Sunday, and my father was downtown in the Japanese community hall cleaning it up because we were going to have a talent show that night. We were actually combining with the LDS community. We're going to have a big talent show to raise enough money so we could have indoor plumbing, because we had to walk down the hill to the outhouses when we'd have gatherings there. So we heard it on the radio, and my father came home. He was like this. He said, police came and chased us home. And we told him what had happened. He said, oh, no wonder. So how ridiculous would it be to say to the police, we're going to have a talent show so we can have indoor plumbing. And they thought that we were cleaning up to have a big celebration. So the next day, Monday, I went to school. I was in the 4th grade, and one boy called me a Jap and spit on me. And I was so bewildered. I just couldn't make sense of it. Well, I cried, I went home, and from that point until the camp situation came up.
How did things change for you in the community? Now, you already had 2 brothers in the service at that point, right?
Yes. My one brother had volunteered in June of 1941. His furlough was put off 2 months in a row, and in November, he said, our furloughs have been canceled. I'm being shipped to the coast of California to guard the coast. What was that about? And there were 5,000 Japanese American soldiers already in the U.S. Army by December 7, 1941. 5,000. And what were they doing about drafting in 1940 and 1941 to the point that there were 5,000 Japanese American boys in the Army? They were not allowed to be in anything but the infantry because they were not loyal enough to be in the Navy or the Air Force. However, there was one young man, and some of you may have seen the public television program of a hero named Ben Kuroki, who was from Nebraska or Kansas. What in the world were they doing in there? Just one family, and somehow he got into the Air Force and became an ace. He had many successful missions in Europe, so he was not discharged, but sent back to the States very early, and he went around to all these camps that we were in, to lobby people to go in the service and buy U.S. war bonds. And there was this big story about his life, which maybe some of you saw. And he found out, before he died, he reflected back, he said he realized he was being used by the U.S. government to propagandize. And so when he came to the camp, I actually saw Ben Grogi.
Now, I understand your brother Half enlisted in the summer of '41, but your oldest brother Tot was also in the military by December 7th as well.
The first week of December, he was drafted and had to go to Portland for his physical and went in the service. So I had 2 brothers already in, and the other 3 brothers served at some time before the war ended. So all 5 of them were in the service.
So how did things change for you and your family immediately after the attack in Hood River?
Well, right away, we were told that we were probably going to be removed from our homes, so get ready. And so we knew by January something was going to happen. We didn't know how or when. So then it was in May 13th, 1942. All those dates are just so imprinted in my mind that I can just recite all of them.
But we need to talk about Executive Order 9066, right?
Oh yes, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and it wasn't until I was in my 50s that I read some of the wordings, and it said aliens, that would be my father and mother, because they didn't have citizenship because they weren't allowed to become naturalized until the 1950s. And aliens and non-aliens alike. I thought, I'm not a non-alien, I'm a citizen. So I want to talk a little bit about euphemisms. You know, we have a habit of giving new names to things that we don't want to face as reality. So, for instance, a toilet is not a restroom. You don't go there to rest. It's not even a washroom. You don't go there to wash. It could be a reading room like David and his dad used to use. Well, these camps, first of all, we were relocated. We were evacuated. We were sent to assembly centers. I call them hurry up and lock them up. How are you going to put 120,000 people someplace to protect them from their neighbors or whatever reason? And then when the larger camps are prepared for you, you are sent to them as relocation camps. I call my talk Detained by My Country. Detained usually means you're going to be kept someplace for a little while. And then pretty soon you're going to get to go someplace, right? Get out. So many of the Japanese people said, how long are we going to have to be in these camps? And they said, for the duration. What does the duration mean? It has no end. I mean, it could be 2 weeks, or it could be 3 weeks, or it could be 3 years. In our case, it was at least 3 years, and for some people, it's 4 years. I forgot the question.
So, we just wanted you to talk about Executive Order 9066 and what were the arguments in support of it at that point. You might also talk about the details and how it got applied in this case.
Yes. Of course, we are considered to be a threat to the national security because, after all, as somebody said, a Jap is once a Jap, always a Jap. And my parents were called Issei. In Japanese, ichi means one, so Issei means the first generation. That would be the immigrant group. Their children, all born in the United States, like me, are called the ni, second ni, ichi ni, nisei, and their children are sansei, and their children are yonsei, and now we have gosei in our family generations.
But the rationale for 9066 was?
Yes, they thought they thought the fishermen off the coast of California were setting off signals to the Japanese government, the army, and there were acts of sabotage going to happen if they hadn't happened already, and it turned out that the government stated after the war was over there was not one act of sabotage to the war.
And I might point out at the time, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was very straightforward about saying, we have no evidence of any disloyalty or potential for sabotage among this population. But
President Roosevelt wanted him to wash his hands of the situation. He didn't want to face it, so he turned it over to the military to take care of the situation. Well, you know what the reputation of the military is. So they were in charge of carrying out this thing. So how are you going to house 120,000 people just like that? So they sent us to 16 assembly centers, each of which had anywhere from 7,000 to 12,000, I think earlier you might have seen. And we were sent to Pinedale, which is in Fresno, is part of the city of Fresno now. And we were there for perhaps 3 months or so, at which time they were able to get these relocation centers, which are larger, more permanent camps. And at that time, we were sent to Tule Lake, California, just south of the Oregon border, not too far from Klamath Falls. Did you ask me about the conditions there?
not yet.
Oh. Well, oh yes. There were 503 Japanese people in Hood River. And Hood River is orcharding. It's a valley, so none of them lived in town, except one family, Mr. Yasui, who had a store, a general store. And there's a wonderful book called Stubborn Twig. If you haven't read it, you should read. It's about the Yasui family. Well, the rest of the people lived on orchards all the way up the valley, even to Parkdale, which was probably 15 to 18 miles from town. So those 503 people had to report to the train station in downtown Hood River to be hauled off to this camp. Well, we didn't know where we were going, how long it would take, or what. And we were all put a tag on us, like this, on each person and on each bag that we took. And we could take only what we could carry. And although I was 9 years old, I had to carry 2 things because, you know, you want to take as much as you can, but you can't. There's another book called Only What We Could Carry, which is another one that some of you may want to look into. So I'm all excited. My first train ride. But we get on the train, and there are soldiers at each end, and they say, pull the blinds and don't look out the windows. So from Hood River, Oregon to Fresno, California, we ride this train with the blinds, windows covered. So that kind of ruined my first train trip. It just occurred to me that we couldn't drive our cars. How did we get to the train station? So there were some people in Hood River who knew we were leaving. Many did not. But some friend or a neighbor had to take us to the train station. I don't remember how we got there, but I suspect it was Carl and Hazel Smith, who are our neighbors, our good neighbors that I want to talk about at the end of this presentation because that's a very important part of the story.
What sort of arrangements did your father make for his land, for your family's land?
Well, my dad worked very hard, and he had 7 children, basically, to provide for. And from 1910 or 11, when he bought that land up in the hills, until 1941, he had acquired 2 more orchards. He had 3 orchards, and he had no mortgages, and he had money in the bank. And we used to tease him and say, "You're not Japanese, you're Scotch." And because he was like this. But imagine in that period of time, to have 3 properties paid for, money in the bank, and raise 7 kids. So we were in a very good situation, because when people were threatened in the camps with not paying their taxes, not paying their mortgages, of course they lost it. But we never lost ours. Thank God for my Scotch dad.
You also had friends that sort of helped looked after the land a bit while you were gone, right?
Yes, fortunately we had some good neighbors who kind of kept an eye on things. However, one of the third property my father had was not a very good one, so he chopped down all the trees and replanted with nice young trees. And before the 7-year harvest came, we were sent off to camp. And so he never was able to enjoy the fruits of his labor on that one. And it wasn't until years later I realized, after we came back from the camps, my brother and I had to do all the shopping, all the farm hauling of fertilizer and spray and boxes and fruit, and I did all the shopping because life was so miserable in town for my parents. They never went back to town after the couple experiences they had. I was on this tab.
You were going to talk about that other property.
This man who had his property next to my father's wrote to us in the camp and said, the person who's leased your place is not taking good care of the orchard. Do something about it. The worms are crawling over to my property. And my father was pretty sure he was lying, and so he didn't answer him at all. And sometime later he said, do something about it or I'm taking you to court. We don't have any income. We're locked up, and we're expected to get a lawyer to fight this man. My father held off as long as he could, and he finally, because not knowing, are we going to get to go home? If so, how long is it going to be? And so he gave up and sold the property to the neighbor, which is what the man had in mind in the first place, which my father suspected. And it was such a pain for him to have to look at that property. I know this later, it came upon me, because my brother and I would say, let's go for a Sunday drive. And my dad would say, where are you going? And my brother said, well, the Sunday drive, we don't know where we're going, we're just going to drive around. He said, well, I think I'll stay home. And I believe it was so painful for him, the possibility of having to drive past that orchard, which was not on the way to places we'd ordinarily go to. We wouldn't go past to go to town. We had to go back and on a side road. Today, it's across from the country club. Can you imagine how valuable that orchard is? And what a heartbreak that was for my father. The last few years of his life, he was able to go drive past that, and he never said a word.
If you read the history of the Japanese Americans in California, you'll find that the land grabs down there were much more nasty and vast and just unfair. The banks and the Americans who snatched up land away from the Japanese Americans who were sent off to the camps. It was our family got out pretty lucky by comparison.
And the trouble was, when you have a fruit orchard, you really have to own the property. You can't lease, you can, but it doesn't work well. However, people in California or even in Gresham area and so on were vegetable farmers, truck gardeners. And you have to have a lot more acreage to make a living raising vegetables. And so most Japanese didn't own those lands. They had to lease them. So when it came time to come back, nobody would lease them, so many couldn't come back. Because if they wanted to be a farmer, where were they going to do it? But we had our land, so we were able to come back.
So you got taken to Pinedale for a few months, and then to Tule Lake, the first permanent camp.
For a year or so. Mm-hmm.
But then you were moved from there, and how did that process
Well, there was a
come out?
very interesting thing. You know, when Pearl Harbor, my brothers are already in the Army, 5,000 of them, and Pearl Harbor's attacked, and they say, well, wait a minute, these guys might not be very loyal. So they quit drafting Japanese American boys. And then they decided we were so well behaved in the camp, said, well, maybe they are loyal enough. We need more men. So they came into the camps and said, you need to volunteer and fight for your country. And half of the guys said, the hell we will. The other half said, sure, anything to get out of this hellhole. That made a huge chasm between these Nisei and these Nisei. We're still trying to heal that break. The ones who said, I'm not going in there, the government took away my rights, and you guys don't have the courage to stand up and say, we want our rights removed. And the guys who went in the Army, some of them said, you guys are just draft dodgers. So that's what happened there.
But the government made a much more explicit and literal process, that division.
At first they tried to get people to volunteer, but they needed more. So they decided to draft them. They did draft them out of the camps, and that's when that division came. There was also a questionnaire that was required to be answered by all persons 17 and up. And it was the Army's idea to try to sort the sheep from the goats, so to speak.
On the basis of their loyalty.
Yes, there were a number of questions, but they were only interested in 2 of them, which turned out to be loyalty questions. The first one said, I will pledge complete allegiance to the United States of America and forswear allegiance to any foreign power. This is being asked of people who've been locked up, not allowed to become citizens, and the ones who were citizens were like us, my generation, to say, you lock us up and you want us to say, we love you? And then the other one, that's forswearing allegiance. And the other one is,
and having grown up in the U.S. and not having had any allegiance to a foreign power in the first place, the question's a bit like, when did you stop beating your wife?
And the other question was, I will serve in the armed services at any time I'm called to do so. And you're asking this of my 69-year-old father? Well, if you answered no to those 2 questions, you were called no-nos and disloyal. If you answered yes, yes, you were considered loyal. And my father, being a smart man he was, 69 years old, he's not going to go in the Army, but he says yes. And so he said yes, so we are considered loyal. So we were sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And some people were sent to Arkansas. We thought they were going to the end of the world. Arizona, Idaho, Utah, the other 9 relocation centers. The ones who said no were considered disloyal and were kept in Tule Lake, which got to be a segregation center where the no-nos from the other 9 camps were sent to Tule Lake. Can you imagine what a hotbed of anger and emotion was there? I found out in 2006, when I went to a pilgrimage to Tule Lake, that after we left, when we had 4 sentry guard stations, guard towers, they put up 8 more towers. They brought in Army tanks, and they added 100 more NPs to guard the camp and the folks. So they had a lot of problems there, of course. And the people started saying, we're going to be loyal to Japan. And they had a lot of riot-like things. But that was, Tule Lake was okay for us. The only difference was, I thought I was having a good time playing with kids close by when I had to walk a quarter mile on my orchard to the nearest neighbor to play. But in that assembly center, first of all, they had a census every night. Somebody would come around and count heads to make sure they're the right number of heads in the house. And there were 7 of us in that one room that we slept in. And then they gave us script, $5 for the adults, $3 for the children, and that was to help you buy toothpaste and whatever in the canteen, there wasn't much there to buy, but they quit giving that to us after the first month. every night there would be a searchlight that would run over the camp, very much like a used car lot, has. And as I lay in bed, I could, with your eyes closed, you can see a bright light when it passes you. And as I lay there, I could see that thing coming around and think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And after that, for 3 months, and went to Tule Lake, there was no searchlight, but there still was. And I'd go to bed, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's the kind of thing you read about in the war, things that affect you that you're not aware of. So I had a good time, and I had a positive experience in many ways, but I still remember my family number. I remember we left on May 13th, 1942, and I know we came home on April 20th, 1945. So that tells you what this did to 120,000 people.
So it was kind of a fun experience for you, other than the tough weather conditions in camp. Describe how it was for your older brothers and sisters, however. It was a little different for them.
My older sister.
And your folks.
Yeah, my older sister, who just celebrated her 94th birthday. She and I are the only two left of the 8 of us. She had just graduated from high school. She's 9 years older than I am. And for her, it was a very different experience, bleak. What am I going to do? I can't go to college. I can't get a job. I can't go anywhere. So for her, it was a disaster. I was having fun. I had no idea. My parents were saying, what's going to happen to our house? What's going to happen to our orchard? Are we ever going to get to go home? How many years are we going to stay here? Are our sons going to get killed in the war? While I was having a good time. My sister was...
You were 10 years old when you went to the camp.
When I left at 9, and I celebrated my 10th birthday in the Assembly Center.
So you were 9 to 12?
Yes.
9 to 11.
When I came home, I came when I was 12, and I turned 13 from April to June. My birthday's in June.
So anything else about the experience, as you understand it, for your siblings and your parents in the camp?
What do I remember?
How their experience was different from the relatively fun time you were having.
Well, I think for children my age, it's pretty much the same. In many other families, my parents were very unusual people, and you don't appreciate your parents till it's too late. And I realized the reason we had as good an experience as we could have out of this was because of my parents, particularly my father, who was the head of the household and pretty much called the shots. My mother lived in the United States long enough that she'd pipe in and give her 2 cents worth, but then my dad says, okay, you've had your say, now we're going to do this. And she accepted that. And people would say about my mother, good grief, she gave birth to all those children, and she stayed home, and she made our clothes, she cleaned the house, she cooked, she did the laundry, and then she worked 10 or 12 hours out in the orchard with my dad. She must have been miserable. And I said, no, in some ways she was happy because she was the most successful person around. Because in order to be a good wife and a good mother, she had to do these things, and she did them all, so she was a complete success. So sometimes it's not what you do or think or say, it's how you live. That makes sense.
So internees were asked to enlist. They had to they were asked to grow victory gardens and do a lot of stuff to support the war effort, as well as being imprisoned.
In fact, Tule Lake, we had victory gardens outside the camp, huge ones. We raised all the vegetables we needed to feed our camps, and what was left over was sent out to the rest of you to eat. And my father, being a farmer, was made to be a foreman of work crew, and to leave the camp you had to go through a gate like you see in movies of army camps where there's guy with a gun there to make sure the right people were going in and out. They get on a truck and they go out, work all day, and then come back. Now my dad said, you know, since there are so many migrating birds that come right in that area, because Tule Lake, there used to be 2 lakes, and one of them was drained, and the lake bottom was where Tule Lake Camp was built. So if you dug into the sand, you could find all these little shells, and my mother and all the ladies would put those in a Clorox bucket until they turned white, and they made jewelry, which I have there showing there the jewelry my mother made in 1942, 43, out of shells dug out of the river, lake bottom in Tule Lake. And there were many birds that go through there, and the other lake that still had water in them was close to the Victory Gardens. So my dad said that there were so many birds you could just reach down and pick them up. So he did. He had an old Levi Army jacket that my brother had sent, and with huge pockets. And he had taken his lunch in a bread sack or something, and he picked up one of those birds and put them in his pocket. We had bird dinner that nobody else had.
So the Asais were one of the first families to return to Hood River. Tell about that process. What happened?
Okay. I should mention, too, that my oldest brother had a furlough before he's going to be sent overseas. And my 2 brothers, the first 2 brothers I told you about, went to the Pacific Theater to fight against the Japanese. One was in military intelligence. And when my oldest brother had his furlough, the law was no soldiers could visit any of the camps that were in Washington, Oregon, or California. And since we were in Tule Lake, California, he could not visit us. So for his whole furlough, he had to wander around. The Japanese people were sent to Minidoka, Idaho. He was able to visit them. My sister happened to finally get to Salt Lake City to go to business college on the money that my 2 brothers would send home from their Army paychecks. My dad said, okay, you can have those if you can figure it out. So she went to Salt Lake, so my brother was able to visit her. But then my other brother got his furlough, and we were in Heart Wyoming, so of course he could visit us. He came and stayed 2 days and disappeared. And my mother said, what happened to him? He didn't say anything, and where did he go? And he wrote a letter and said, I am sorry, but I couldn't stand to see my parents and my brothers and sisters locked up when I'm going off to fight in the war in the Pacific Theater. I couldn't stand it, so I left.
Going home.
So finally, we were told we could leave the camps. They decided we weren't as dangerous as they thought, and we were well behaved, and there was a Supreme Court decision that said we cannot keep these people locked up anymore. So my brother, who was in high school, and I was in the 7th grade, we were overjoyed. We wanted to go home. However, the people in Hood River didn't want us to come back. And that was true of many, many communities. But Hood River had a reputation of being one of the most racist towns in Oregon, and the American Legion put on a huge campaign to try to discourage us from coming home. And later you can look at these boards here that have the full-page paid advertisements every week in the Hood River News, with some Japs are once a Jap, always a Jap, no Japs wanted back in the river, signed by people that had signed this petition every week. And in a town like Hood River, there are only so many people, and you get that many columns of names. There aren't many left that didn't sign those, but I can tell you some that didn't. I can count them on the fingers of my hands.
Well, you were actually seeing these ads, these newspapers back in the camp.
Yes, and my mother was frightened. My mother was always a worrier. She did all the worrying and the fearing for the whole family, so the rest of us didn't have to. And she was reading these, seeing these, and she was scared to death. And my one brother who was deferred, back then if you had 2 sons in the Army, you didn't have to, so they classified those people 4C, which are considered people who weren't loyal enough to be in the Army. So my brother was 4C, and so he was not in the Army. He was in Chicago working at the time, and he decided that he and his buddies, 2 buddies, would go and test the waters because of the discrimination there. Said it might not be safe, so wait. So they went home, and my brother wrote to my dad and said, if you're going to come home, you better come right away, because the Selective Service Committee has changed our classification from 4C to 1A. That means eligible for draft immediately. They wanted to get my brother and his 2 buddies out of there, and that's what they tried to do. Well, my brother's the only one who got drafted because Ray Sato had flat feet, and the other guy couldn't see very well. He had very bad eyes, so they got rejected. So my brother Min had to go off in the Army at that point. So my dad says, okay, he says we should go home now. We got to do it now. Who all wants to go home? There were only 4 of us left of the original 7. My brother in high school, me, and my mom and dad. My dad voted, my brother voted, I voted, and my mother voted no. And my dad said, you're outvoted 3-1. We're going home. You can stay here if you want. So of course we all went home. And every time somebody threw a rock through our window and on our front room, or stole the gas out of our underground tanks because we had more ration stamps for gas since we're farmers. People would come and pump the gas out of our pumps and scare us in various ways. My mother would weep and say, that's why I didn't want to come home. My dad was like a tough coach in the dugout. He'd sit us down just about every week and say, that's what they want us to do. They want to discourage us and give up and leave, but we're not going to, because we have just as much right to stay here as they do. So with that, we survived. My dad every week giving us this big sermon, if you want to call it. And we made it until things got better and better. The discrimination lasted quite a while. It was that first couple of years were the most miserable years of my life.
You had some experiences of your own, personally.
Yes. My brother was the first to attend high school, and he was the only Japanese-American boy at that point, because we were the first family to go home, and we were they were testing the waters in the camp to see how we were going to do, so nobody else came home with had kids until September. We came home in April. Well, my brother was called in by the principal and said, I hope you don't turn out for any interscholastic sports. And my brother said, why not? My brother was very smart. He knew exactly what was happening. He said, why not? He said, well, because you might be embarrassed. He said, oh, I wouldn't be embarrassed. Well, your teammates might be embarrassed. Why would they be embarrassed? Well, you have to play out-of-town games, and other town kids are going to come play here, and you know, my brother says, oh, it's okay, don't worry, I won't turn out for anything. So he played intramural sports. He was very athletic, and he went to Oregon State College, it was then, and he was very active in sports in Corvallis. I was walking 1.25 miles to school every day by myself, and these kids that I grew up with, grades 1 through 4, wouldn't speak to me, wouldn't walk with me, wouldn't walk and play at recess with me, and worse than that, halfway to the school, Mrs. Bettesworth would come out and yell at me and sick her dog at me, morning and afternoon. So all through the rest of the 7th grade and all the 8th grade, I was completely socially isolated. And when you're 13, that's pretty painful.
That happened at church, too.
Oh, yes. I needed to be around people, so I went to church every Sunday, and I had to walk 1.5 miles to do that. And the first times I sat in a pew, and nobody seemed to sit with me. So I decided I'd better sit on the other side of the aisle where the pews were shorter, so I wouldn't take up so much room. I thought, Some people have to sit in the back of the bus, but I have to sit in the side aisles of the church. And nobody, there were two people, Mrs. Clee and Mrs. Stranahan, who always spoke to me, were kind to me, and sometimes Mrs. Stranahan would be driving to church past me and she'd pick me up. But those are the only two of that church. And that was the first Christian church. So that, and I sat in the Sunday school class with my schoolmates, and nobody talked to me except the teacher, who was a vocational education teacher at the high school, Mr. Van Blericum. I'll never forget him. And the minister at that time was such that when you leave the church, you know, you always shake the minister's hand. And he would shake my hand like this, would never look at me. After he was replaced, the new minister was very kind, and he was totally different. And the funny thing was that my first grade teacher, her husband had a store. It was 1 mile to the stores. There were 2 stores, and he owned the one, and he had a no Jap Trade sign, his, and his wife was my first and second grade teacher. And I could not, I tried to talk to my teacher when I'd see her, and she would turn and walk away. I stood in line in the bank once, and she was in the next line. And I looked and smiled at her, and she didn't even wait to get her business done in the bank. She just left the bank. So you can imagine how I felt. I just really, I even thought I should commit suicide, but I was too scared.
Now, a lot of the businesses in Hood River after the war had this sign in the window, no Jap Trade. So talk a little bit about how your family did business and got by in that kind of environment.
Well, we had to drive to Portland or the Dalles oftentimes. Or we go up to Parkdale, which I mentioned before, 15 miles up the valley, because Mr. McIsaac had a store, a general store up there, and he would do business with us. But the worst thing is that we couldn't get any mechanics to work on cars or vehicles. And when you're a farmer, that's a real problem, because if your tractor breaks down in the middle of harvest, which it did for us, you're in a pickle. So our tractor broke down, and my dad said, you know, Ormond, who has that Windmaster Corner place, a gas station in front and a shop in the back, he came and wanted to pick strawberries for me when he was 5 years old. And I told him, you're too young, you'll pull the stems off, so no, and he cried, so I said, okay, I hired him to pick strawberries. He is now the grand exalted ruler of the Elks Lodge in Hood River. Surely he could help us. So take the thing down. I figured out it was the magneto or something. So my brother and I drive down and take this magneto and tell Ormond we'd like to have that fixed. And he said, well, you know, the guy in the shop is just renting from me. It's not mine, and I can't do it myself. And he said, and I know he won't do it if he knows it's yours. So I'll tell you what, you come back tonight after dark and put it under the bush in front of the gas station. We were so desperate. That's what my brother and I did. We put that thing under there, and each night we'd go back hoping it was fixed and back there. It took 2 or 3 nights, and that was disaster in the harvest time. But we were so desperate. We did stuff like that. It's kind of funny now, but it was pretty serious.
There were a few people who courageously stood up to support and defend the Japanese-American family, such as yours. Please tell us about some of them and what they meant to you and your family.
There was a Mrs. Max Moore. They had an electric shop for lighting fixtures and, you know, plug-ins and stuff like that. She was very courageous in standing up for the Japanese-American people. There was a minister of the Methodist Church who spent so much time helping us that his congregation asked him to leave. In fact, in the Methodist Church, there's a bishop, and the bishop tells you, go here, go there, you have to move. And so there was so much pressure that he was moved and sent to Shed, Oregon. Anybody know where Shed is? It's a wide place in the road. And it was just a slap in the face to Reverend Burgoyne. But Reverend Burgoyne received the Thomas Jefferson Award, National Award, and he couldn't afford to go to receive it. So the Japanese American folks in the valley raised the money so he could go to receive this award. When my brother eloped to marry, he went all the way to Spokane, which is where Reverend Burgoyne decided he didn't want to be under the bishop in Oregon. So he moved to Washington, and he was in Spokane, Washington, in the Methodist church up there. My brother and his elopee went to Spokane to get married under, and then there were, the person who had the other store, a mile from my house, also had a no Jap Trade sign, and that was Mr. Sheriff. And Mr. Sheriff came with tears in his eyes when we were to leave for camp, gave us an address book and said, "Be sure to write to me." And when we came home, there was a no Jap Trade sign in his store. I had to walk past that every day to and from school. And one day, I thought, when is anybody ever going to walk with me or associate with me? And one day, Mae Vernon walked home from school with me. She lived about the same place that Mrs. Bettesworth lived, a woman who sicked her dog and yelled at me every day. So we went past the store and she said, "Let's go in and buy some jawbreakers." Anybody know what those are? About this big. And I said, "Oh, I think I'll just go on ahead." And she said, "Come on." And I thought, Mae Vernon, are you blind? There's been a no Jap Trade sign on that window for a year, but you know, when you're young, you don't pay attention to things very well. So she went in and she bought jawbreakers for both of us. So each of us had one in each cheek. I was so happy. I had jawbreakers and I had Mae Vernon. And we're walking up the road, and what do you know? Here comes Mrs. Bettesworth. I never saw her out on the road before. She was always in front of her house. I used to walk in the ditch because I was short and there were tall weeds. I figured she wouldn't be able to see me, but she was waiting. She was watching time and would meet me. So here she comes, and I thought, oh no, not now. So as we got closer to Mrs. Bettesworth, I started walking very fast away from Mae, and she said, "Why are you going so fast?" And I just waved at her. And when I thought Mrs. Bettesworth was up to where Mae was, I turned around to see what was going to happen. And I saw Mrs. Bettesworth saying, "Why, Mae Vernon, I thought you had more respect than to walk with a dirty yellow Jap." And Mae was a very nervous, high-strung girl. Her face turned red and she started shaking. Her mouth moved, but nothing came out. She said, come back, we'll tell my parents and we'll fix Mrs. Bettesworth." I said, "Oh, sure. Your mother's a teacher at my school and she's never spoken to me. Your father is a mechanic. He won't work on our tractors and our cars and trucks." But I went home. I thought, well, that's the end of Mae Vernon walking with me, I guess. The Vernons were LDS folks. And she went home and told her parents, "This happened so much, and this is the biggest lesson for I can preach to you." They knew what was right. They stood up for right when it was not too public, and it was on an individual basis where nobody else was around. So Mrs. Vernon went over to Mrs. Bettesworth and said, "What you did today is unacceptable. Although I've been buying eggs, butter, and cheese from you, I'm not going to buy from you anymore. And you need to quit doing that, what you're doing." But she didn't speak to me at school, and her husband didn't work on our cars. Sometimes people would speak to us when there was no one else around. But if you walked downtown and you saw them on the street, they didn't know you. So that's what happens when people don't have moral courage, a backbone.
That did have an advantage for you, though. You saw the effect. when you went by Mrs. Bettesworth's.
Yes. And she no longer could do that. But she didn't yell at me or sick her dog. She'd just come to this road and stare at me with her elbows like this, saying, well, I can't yell at you, I can't sick my dog, but I can still stand here and glare at you as you go by. And so Mrs. Bettesworth didn't go to church on Sundays, but she went to Ladies' Aid Society. Ever heard of that? On Thursdays or something, get together. So she'd go to that. And so when they have a fundraiser like a spaghetti dinner or something, she would help on those. And one of those times, by this time, I was able to participate in things. She was serving up the spaghetti, and when I got up to the kitchen counter where they served, she saw me and she threw the spoon down and walked away. And somebody else saw it happen and saw the situation, immediately hurried up and served me my food.
I remember you telling some stories about a German woman who kind of called people out too.
Oh, that's my neighbor, Mrs. Moller. She was one of these people who had, and she's the kind of person you don't want to cross, you know. She was tall and strong, and she had a loud voice, and she would go downtown to the stores that had no Jap Trade signs, and she'd buy something she didn't even need, something that was 25 cents or something, and just before she'd hand over the money, she said, oh, my maiden name is Oberteufel. Does that make any difference? Her married name was Moller, which really was German too. And I used to clean house for her to make money when I was in high school, and sometimes I'd call her up and she'd say, I'm making cheese on the stove, I can't talk to you now, bam. That's the way she was, but she's a great person.
But I understand she was specifically calling people out on their cowardly behavior, wasn't she?
Oh yeah, and some of the men who were in the American Legion Post, they're leaders of that. One man was actually the grandfather of one of my good friends in high school. Oh, yes. She'd see Mr. Perkins, that was his name, Mr. Perkins on the street, and she said in her very loud voice, why, Mr. Perkins, what a big, handsome man you are. And to think a guy like you would pick on a poor Japanese woman, widow woman, and scare her at night by sending your high school boys through her driveway and honking their horn and flashing a light in her house. But you are handsome. Things like that I couldn't even imagine if I wanted to try to think up something.
So do you find anything unique about this particular dark chapter in U.S. history? What lessons might we draw from the 20th century Japanese American experience?
Well, when 9/11 happened, there happened to be a Japanese exchange student in my home at that time. And I said, just you wait. The same thing's going to happen to the Muslims and the Arab folks in this country. And she looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I said, it won't be too long, maybe in about 3 months. It was 2 weeks, maybe. And so I think in order to come out of any negative experiences in your life, you need to gain strength from that. You cannot be put down. And it behooves all of us to accept people, whether they're Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Jews, LGBTQ folks, men or women. We need to look at our brothers and sisters of this wonderful human family, the human race, If we don't, we're sunk. This is a photo of Heart Mountain, Wyoming, the camp I lived in. This is pretty much what all 10 relocation centers look like. All tar paper, black tar paper barracks side by side, nailed down by lath. I lived on in that barrack kind of at the left end of that photo. I don't know who took that photo because we weren't allowed to have cameras, but somehow we saw in the earlier video that Toby showed, I don't know where those photos came from. They must have been government folks who took those and kind of put them together. I know that when we went home to Hood River, some people came and took these beautiful photos of my mother and sister with hose, and my father pouring water into the tractor, and my brother holding a branch of the fruit tree with fruit hanging on it, all with smiles. And this was when the things were happening that I just told you about. No mechanical work, stores closed to us, nobody walking with me. All that was happening, but we had these beautiful pictures with smiles, and our friends who were still in the camp said, "Oh, we saw these wonderful pictures of your family, and your mother was hoeing, your dad was putting water in the tractor." And I thought, oh, those were propaganda pictures they were taking of us, of how wonderful it was to be back home on the Pacific coast, look how well adjusted and happy they are now, and we were having a tough time. But that was because they were having a hard time getting the Japanese Americans to leave the camps. They said, "You're free now, you can go home." Well, we were each given a bus ticket or a train ticket, and $25 each, I believe it was. So for us, the four of us, we got $100 and a bus ticket home.
But when you're hearing about all the nastiness back there, a lot of people just didn't want to go, and the federal government didn't want to pay the money to keep the guards and the camps running, so now they were having to try to shove them out of there any way they could.
Now I want to tell you about Carl and Hazel Smith and Mrs. Max Moore and Reverend Burgoyne formed a group they call League for Liberty and Justice, which the name they took from the last words of the Pledge of Allegiance. I believe that's what, right? And they were, as I told you, I can count them on the fingers of my hands. They suffered like we did. Remember that store that's 1 mile from our house where the man came and with tears in his eyes and brought the address book? He was a cousin to Mrs. Smith, Hazel Smith. And one day when my brother first went back to Hood River, our house was still occupied, so he couldn't live in our house. So he stayed with Carl and Hazel Smith. So when Hazel was in her cousin's store one day, Ralph Sheriff, her cousin, said, "Hazel, I don't approve of the way you're dealing with this Jap situation." And she said, "Why don't you just come right out and say you don't approve of having men Asai staying in my house?" "Well, I don't care to do business with you anyway." And she walked out and never went into that store, her cousin's store, again. And many of those people were not served in the stores where no Jap Trade signs were, because they were friendly to us. That's a kind of moral courage you need to have. Everybody knows what's right, but most people just don't have the strength, the moral courage to do what's right. And I have to bless those people who helped us. We really needed help, and they gave more than they needed to, and they were just saints. I think.
All right, if anybody has any questions, my brother will bring around the cordless mic. You want to ask my mom something?
Just raise your hand and I'll come to you.
Where's the picture?
I have read, doing this correctly? Yeah. I've read that there have been attempts to award reparations to some of the Japanese people who were in these camps. What has come of that, or has there ever been legislation paid in reparations?
There was an Evacuations Claims Act that said if you could apply and say you lost so many thousand, that you lost so many $1,000 for losing your property or whatever, and the rumor was that if you thought you lost 40,000, you applied for 20,000, and if you're lucky, you got 10,000. That's pretty much what happened with that. Since we lost that one property, the one that my father first started, because nobody would lease it, so in the boondocks, and you can't let an orchard go 3 years so my father had to sell that for pasture land. And so that was a big loss. And he didn't want to apply for this because it brought back too many painful memories. After all, he delivered 6 babies there. So he didn't do it. And my brother Min, at that time, was just married, and he was going to buy an orchard of his own, and he'd asked my dad if he would help him with a mortgage. And my dad said, and Min said, why don't you apply for this evacuation claims? Because the money's been appropriated by Congress, and my dad said, I don't really want to. He said, well, if you let me, I'll do the paperwork and everything. And so my dad says, okay. My brother just above me, Dick, was going to graduate school. He was working on his PhD in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. And so my dad said, well, you apply, and whatever you can get, you can have half of that for your mortgage, and the other half we'll send to Dick for to finish his doctorate. So they did, and basically that's what happened. 40,000 you lost, you applied for 20,000, and maybe you got 10,000. That's the first one. Then, of course, there was the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1988 or 89. And that one said the evacuation, the whole World War II thing was wrong, and we owe an apology, and we need to pay reparations. And that was passed, so any person who lived in the camps was allowed to receive $20,000. My father and mother were dead. They're the ones who should have gotten that. My brothers were in the Army, so of course they didn't get it. So people like me got it. I'm this happy kid playing with kids, and I get $20,000. My friend, who was the social studies teacher in the high school where I taught, he said to his classes, how many of you would be willing to give up your civil rights and be locked up for 3 years for $20,000? And nobody raised his hand, even high school teenagers in this era.
How long did the discrimination last in Hood River? Or when did it start getting better? Or is it still there?
Everybody hear the question?
It's not just in Hood River, and it's not just in Oregon. I couldn't date, I couldn't go to dances through high school. I could, but as I told Tom, I love to go to high schools and talk because I know how to get to them. I say, how would you like it if they told you you can only date 2 boys in the high school? Of course, one of them is stupid and the other one's ugly, but that's your choice. The same with you. How would you like it if there were only 2 girls? They're not bad looking, but they're both stupid. I suffered those times because, of course, I wanted to date and wanted to go dancing. I never learned to dance as a result. It wasn't until I was a high school teacher that my students taught, I had to chaperone their dances. They taught me how to dance. And I went to the 61st high school class reunion of my students. And every time I go there, this one boy always says, let's dance, because he's the one who taught me how to dance.
That was at Cresswell, by the way.
Cresswell
South
High
of
School,
Eugene.
just south of Eugene. When I got to the university, I had my first date as a freshman in the university. And then...
University of Oregon.
Yes. And in my senior year, they knew that I wanted to study abroad and study French, because that was a language I studied from junior high through high school and through college. And so I get a phone call. This is 1954. And this is Wayne Flynn, and I want to congratulate you. Our Rotary Club has voted to nominate you for the Rotary Fellowship to Study Abroad. Oh, great. I said, are you sure? He said, why do you say that? I said, who are you? He said, well, I'm the new superintendent of schools. I said, oh, I see. And I thought to myself, he's a superintendent. He looked over the candidates from Hood River and decided I would be a good candidate, so he nominated me, and nobody wanted to vote against me because they'd have to say why. So I was nominated, and I was a semifinalist in the state of Oregon for that fellowship, and I didn't get it. And my neighbor, remember Mrs. Moller, the one who hung up her phone and insulted people around with her voice? She told me that her friend, who was Dean Unthank at the University of, no, wait a minute. Her friend, who was the president of Albany College, which later became Lewis and Clark, was on that judging committee for the Rotary Fellowship. And he told my neighbor, Mrs. Moller, Mitzi should have gotten that fellowship, but she lost it on, I voted for her to the very end, but she lost it on 2 counts, because she's Japanese and she's a woman. That's 1954. But the discrimination went underground. It was not famous or acceptable to be like some people are today with what you see. So it just went underground, but it was still there. In fact, when I was in college, I said something to my fellow kitchen crew. I used to work on the kitchen in the dormitory. And they said, well, there isn't that kind of discrimination here in Eugene, is there? I said, well, maybe not in town, but kind of in the outskirts there is. They said, oh, it's just your imagination, Mitzi. So I said, well, I want you to do a little experiment with me. I want you to be my date and drive up the Mackenzie River up at that way. There's a really nice, it used to be called Albert's Lodge or something, which is a fancy place to take your date on the junior, senior prom, you know. And I said, I want you to take me up there, and we'll just go into that place. So on the way back, he said, you're right. And that was when I was in college. Oh, when I'm in, was a high school teacher, and one of my students said to me, Mrs. Loftus, what kind of name is that? Where are you from? I said, well, just look at my face. Can't you tell I'm Norwegian? Well, I was given a Japanese name, as were all of my brothers and sisters. And my name is Mitsuko. It's pronounced Mitsuko. But my friends and all my classmates call me Mitsuko or Mitsuko. Well, because of that discrimination I suffered when I was 12, 13 years old, I decided it's no fun to be Japanese. I'm going to be 200% American. I graduated from an 8th grade elementary school out in the country, but I was going to get on the bus and go to town to be in the 9th grade and high school with other kids from town. they don't know I am Mitsuko or Mitsuko, so I'm going to be Mitzi. So I went to junior high and I registered as Mitzi, but I didn't tell anybody, not even my father or mother. So my report card comes home, and my father looks at it, and he smiles. And he looks at me and smiles. My father was very zen. He didn't ask me any questions. He never brought up the subject. I have been Mitzi ever since. I didn't even have to go to court to change my name.
Mitzi, thank you so much. I am in awe and I'm humbled.
Any other questions, comments?
This is for the two of you. How do you feel about all this? Have you had prejudices?
Dave, you want to answer first?
No, go ahead.
Mom's written a book, and at the very beginning, I'll come to find. Her chapter says, "Who are you?" or "What are you?" Because people look at you and they want to know, what's your background? Where are you from? And I think I'm the youngest by 9 years. My middle brother is 4 years older, and David's 9 years older than me. And I think our experiences were different. David James is my eldest brother. My middle brother, they considered giving him a Japanese name. Kenneth Allen was potentially going to be Kenji. And they chickened out and said, no, I think it's going to be trouble for him, so he's Kenneth Allen. The story of my name is kind of funny. I'll just shorten it and say that my 4-year-old brother named me after the family dog. So I'm Toby. I'm not Tobias or Tobias. It's a true story. But my middle name is my mom's family name, Asai. Now, you hear her and her relatives and my first cousin say A-sah-ee because it's easier for people to say. But me and the younger generation, the Yonsei, are starting to use the original Japanese pronunciation of Asai. And she taught me how to write Asai in Japanese kanji. And I think she recalls seeing me sign my grade school and junior high papers, Toby, Asai, with the Japanese kanji Loftus. So for me, I liked it. Now, certainly when I was in elementary and junior high, I'd heard jokes about Chinks and Japs. And I'd say, well, you know, I am half Japanese. And they'd look at me and they'd say, oh, well, you're different, because I don't appear Japanese. I have another friend who's half Japanese who looks very Japanese, and he got a lot of harassment. Some of it, I'm sure, was based on that fact. I'm proud of my mixed racial heritage. I didn't know my grandparents. My grandmother died before I was born, and grandfather died a year after I was born. I've made several trips with Mom to Japan and collected stories about the family history, and I'm very grateful and very proud of who they were and the legacy that I've received because of them. I think it is a special blessing to be of mixed racial heritage, and I hope and wish more people would consider that and imagine that and embrace that.
Before David talks, I want to remark how things have sort of changed. We were always known as the A-sighs. And so when I went to the university and the literature professor called roll and said, Miss Asai, I didn't answer. And he said, is Miss Asai here? And there's still no sign. And finally, oh, that's me. I didn't recognize it. So when my great niece, who is an attorney in Portland, I was there, I thought, I think I'll just go and see what her office looks like. So I went into this building, and the receptionist there was there, and I said, has Jessica A-sah-ee arrived yet? And she gave me this stern look and said, you mean Asai? And I said, yeah, that one. And after Toby's was given my family name, we felt sorry that we hadn't given David and Ken a Japanese middle name too, but it was good intentions. We didn't.
Is it fair to say Dad would have been more in favor of that than you, though? Didn't he always kind of...
No, I don't think so. In fact, we even considered not having children.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I was going to point that out. I was born in 1959, which is 14 years after the end of the war, 15 years after Mom got out of the camps. And honestly, I do not remember any incidents growing up of being teased or bullied for that particular reason. And it was just astonishing to me years later to find out that my parents actually discussed whether to have children because they were afraid that their kids might suffer the way my mom had suffered. But, you know, even I don't look all that Japanese. Most people have a hard time guessing. I'm half Japanese. My dad was 6'3", mostly Norwegian, some German and French and English, but very pale skin. They look pretty comical dancing together.
Especially Sarah, I came to about here on my husband's chest.
So I certainly looked different, but people couldn't peg me as anything in particular. So I have to think that's sort of what made them hold back by trying to pin anything in particular on me. And when I got to be a junior in high school, I parted my hair in the middle and grew it out to my shoulders, and people they would just assumed I was Native American then, which was kind of cool. And then I went east to go to college, and I lived in Boston for 10 years. And so I was in Boston at the time in the late 70s when the so-called boat people were escaping from Southeast Asia and settling at various places around the country, not only the Northeast, but Louisiana and other places, and we're running into the kind of racism and abuse that various waves of immigrants, from the Irish and the Italians through us to the Arabs and the Muslims today, they were running into that in the late 70s, and suddenly insecure, racist African Americans had somebody they could kick around. So while I was walking the streets of Boston in the late 70s, a couple of times young blacks called me a fucking chink. And I didn't know whether to get angry or laugh, because it was wrong on so many different levels. It was like, to me, it wasn't even threatening. It was just kind of incredibly stupid.
My other son, who's in the middle, was not able to come here, but if you saw him, you probably would not detect any Japanese in him. And so he's very startled when he went to university back east, and a Japanese student came up to him and said, "Excuse me, but are you part Japanese?" He said he couldn't imagine. It was the first time anybody saw it. He said, "I guess it takes one to know one."
I think I was taking a survey by TriMet just a week or two ago online, and they asked, how do you describe themselves? They're working on their inclusiveness and awareness, ethnic awareness and so on and so forth. And I cheerfully refer to myself as a mongrel. If I want to be more specific, I say Japanese American, Asian, whatever. I didn't even want to. I think the only time that there was any kind of an expression of discomfort with my background was when I was applying to college and they ask you to self-identify for the purposes of scholarships or demographics for their admittance, and I was, being an idealistic teen, I was like, I want to be accepted on my performance and my scholastic ability and my extracurriculars and all that stuff. I do not want to take advantage of, superficial things like that. And that was the only time I don't remember what I did, but I was certainly hesitant to mark myself as Asian American.
I did.
But
be sure to check your Asian.
But nowadays, I just love describing myself. I'm a mongrel. Yeah. Mongrels rule. It's great.
So I went back east for school, and I followed my mom's advice to always check Asian American Pacific Islander, which turned out to be, in retrospect, possibly a risk because the admittance rate for Asian Americans was much lower because it was such a popular and exclusive school than it was for everybody else. So for me, when I am faced with a survey asked to self-identify, if it does not give me the option to choose multiple boxes, I will not respond. I don't want to say I'm an Asian American because I'm mixed. I choose both Asian and Caucasian. My dad was Caucasian. I'm not going to reject that. And it was a freshman year in college, I realized, you know, all these years I've been considering myself Asian American. I apologized to Dad. I said, Dad, I'm sorry. He didn't mind. It was okay. But if I do not have the choice to choose multiple boxes or mixed, I will not respond.
Any other questions? So you said you never got to dance and you didn't do, but I happen to know that you had a pretty marvelous husband. Would you just tell us really quickly how you guys got together?
I had already been teaching at Cresswell High School for 2 or 3 years, not quite 3 years. I'd always wanted to teach abroad, and my goal was to eventually go abroad to teach someplace. But I was particularly impressed with Senator Fulbright, who thought up the idea of having exchanges of professors and graduate students to start with, and amazed me that he put forth the idea of the Fulbright program in 1945, just a few days after the atomic bomb was dropped in Japan. Can you imagine the audacity of a man doing that in the Senate? And they passed it. So I have this idealistic idea that that's the best program to go on. So I applied in May or June, someplace in there, for the following school year.
Which year?
1956. And I met Don in July. Well, I'd met him before, but we didn't have any connection. And so then I went to a wedding on the coast. Don was the best man at the wedding, and I was a friend of the groom. And I don't know, it was a strange thing. We couldn't figure out why he was the best man and why I was at a wedding of a groom. But that's when I first met him. And he then found out I'd applied to go abroad, and he said, why don't you withdraw your application? I thought, wow, why does he ask me that? This is something I've wanted to do for years. And then at Christmas, he presented me with a ring, and I said, I don't think I'm ready for this. And he said, well, will you keep it until you're ready? So I put it in the glove compartment. That's how it started.
So you're waiting for the Fulbright.
So I'm waiting for the Fulbright, and somebody advised me, if you don't get accepted, keep applying. It's difficult, but if you keep complying, it's a chance. So by spring vacation, I hadn't heard from them. I said, well, I guess I'm not going to be accepted. So I announced our engagement, and 2 weeks later, I was accepted. And you had to put a first choice, second choice, third choice of where you would like to go. And I wanted to put French-speaking countries, of course. But my father had told us, maybe in words or maybe in just in influence, he said, never let your heart rule your head. I thought, my heart says I want to go to a French-speaking country. My head says, you want to go abroad to teach? You should go to Japan. You can speak the language. You know something about the culture. So I thought, well, okay. So I put Japan as the first. I didn't want to go to Japan. I was still suffering from that reverse prejudice. I didn't want to go to Japan. But I put that first choice and 2 French-speaking countries, second and third. Guess what? I was accepted and got my first choice. So I went to Japan, and it was the best thing.
But you were worried about going abroad. How did you
Yeah. So I'm engaged, I'm going away for a year. That was not in my thoughts of what I would like to do, so I decided, shall I stay home and get married? Shall I just break our engagement and go? Shall I stay engaged and go to Japan and be gone for a year? I had a terrible spring trying to make a decision. I finally decided I'd better stay engaged and go to Japan, because someday after we're married, I don't want to get in an argument and say, if I hadn't married you, I could have gone to Japan. So I went to Japan for a whole year, and when I came back, we came from such different home environments and the cultural difference too, that when he picked me up in San Francisco and drove me up here, and we went to Hood River to visit my parents right away, and I walked in the house and stood about this close to my parents who were sitting at the dining table, and we started talking about the weather and about how the airplane trip was like and what I was going to do. And my husband says, good God, you were gone 3,000 miles for a whole year and you're going to talk about going down to the grocery store? And I said, that's what's so wonderful about that aspect of my cultural background. You know exactly where you stand with each other. It doesn't matter how much time or how many miles you are apart. You take up where you left off, and you don't. I lived in the dormitories. I could hardly believe it. And they say, oh my God, my parents are coming for the weekend. Or getting on the phone and saying, the food is terrible, Mom, send me cookies. Or, I just sent my dirty clothes to you. I sent laundry home for the parents to wash when they're in college. I mean, those were very shocking things to me. And when I was in high school, my friends would say, let's go to the Dells. And I'd say, well, I'm not going. Why not? Because my parents wouldn't like it. How do you know they wouldn't like it unless you ask them? I said, I don't have to ask them. I know exactly what they would say or how they feel. Well, they say, well, I asked my mom. If she says no, I just ask my dad, and then he says yes. Not in my house. And we tried to do that in our household. We were, no matter how much we disagreed, if one of them said or did something, we had to back them up. And sometimes I had a real struggle with
She kind of skipped over the part where Dad flew over midway through her year in Japan and they got hitched. You didn't specify that.
And I think it's important to remember that of the West Coast states, Oregon was the last state to end its anti-miscegenation laws, which prevented interracial marriage. So one of my uncles, Uncle Gene, you saw, the one who eloped, he had to go to Washington State to marry his Caucasian wife because he couldn't legally get married here in the state of Oregon. By the time Mom, the youngest of the 8 children, got married, it would have been legal. But that wasn't that long ago.
Maybe some of you have seen a movie that's recently come out called Loving. About that Loving is the name of the person who was in an interracial marriage. And when I saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, I would have been married illegally in Oregon if that law had not been changed.
Anything else? Well, thank you all for coming.
People often ask me, how did we survive this experience? And I'm going to say a couple words about that. The ability to separate oneself from one's surroundings, to hold on to a belief that one is better than circumstances suggest. One can be treated like animals, but that doesn't make us animals. Those who can hold that kind of thought do better in adversity than those whose sense of self melts into the background and abuse more easily. And I believe it's Samuel, in the final analysis, those who know deeply who they are also know that they remain that person no matter what the circumstances of their lives. Does that sound familiar? To thine own self be true.